I played every single Mario Kart game, and today I'll be ranking them from worst to best. And no, I won't be including Mario Kart Live Home Circuit because that's barely a video game, or the original Mario Kart 8 since it's strictly a lesser version of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. With that said, let's get right into it. At number 11 we have Super Mario Kart for the SNES. This game released 34 years ago, and it's safe to say that it shows. The game is really hard to control, and the tracks are about as simple as you'd imagine them to be. On top of that, the off-road feels insanely overtuned. Even brushing against it for a second can completely kill your speed, which makes the already stiff controls feel even more punishing. Because of the lack of true 3D objects, both item boxes and coins are just picked up directly from the ground, and judging distances in general can be weirdly hard to do from time to time. One thing I've never really seen anyone talk about is that you don't actually play by the same rules as the CPU. In your entries, everyone basically functions under the same system, but here you go faster based on how many coins you're holding. You collect them from the ground, and you lose them whenever you get hit by an item or obstacle. The CPU, meanwhile, doesn't really have to deal with that, meaning they'll always cruise at the same speed whether you like it or not. That, combined with the very obvious rubber banding they use to catch up whenever they fall behind, makes the difficulty feel extremely artificial and nowhere near as fun as the later games. And finally, on a very personal note, this game probably has my most rage-inducing track in the entire series, Vanilla Lake. Between the barely visible ice blocks that completely kill your momentum and the water pits that are way too easy to slip into, it results in one of the most frustrating tracks I've ever played in Mario Kart. At number 10, I'm placing Mario Kart Super Circuit. Take what I said about Super Mario Kart being too hard to read visually and multiply that by 10 for this game. The Game Boy Advance's tiny screen probably didn't help much because the tracks themselves arguably look even harder to parse than they did in SMK. The backgrounds though look beautiful, and they give the tracks a lot of personality. Sadly, the actual gameplay still feels way too stiff, especially considering that this game is played on a D-pad. But my biggest gripe with Super Circuit is how hazards behave. God forbid you ever even think of touching a hazard, because you'll be sliding for what feels like an eternity. Pair that with a track that has no railings, and you can be pretty sure you're going straight off the edge. I don't think it's ridiculous to say that this game feels worse to play than Super Mario Kart, but to be fair, for a Game Boy Advance game, Super Circuit is quite impressive. It tries to deliver a full Mario Kart experience on hardware that clearly wasn't ideal for it, and it deserves credit for introducing the idea of retro tracks before they became a series staple. The problem is that impressive for the GBA doesn't automatically mean fun to play today. I respect Super Circuit more than I actually enjoy it, but it still places above Super Mario Kart because it's essentially an expanded version of that game. It brings back all of Super Mario Kart's tracks while also adding a brand new set of its own. At number 9, I'm placing Mario Kart Tour, the only mobile entry in the series and a very controversial one at that. It's a mobile game, so you already know the drill. Heavy monetization and the usual FOMO style progression that makes the game hard to enjoy unless you're willing to empty your wallet into it. To be fair, the monetization did get a little less awful over time, but the game still very much feels built around keeping you constantly engaged with rotating content instead of just letting you play Mario Kart normally. When it comes to the gameplay itself, Tour also feels closer to an on-rails racer than an actual Mario Kart game. Since it was adapted for touch controls, it never really feels all that satisfying to play, especially compared to the rest of the series. But you've got to give credit where credit is due. The game does look pretty good by mobile standards, and for all its issues, Tour had a pretty interesting track selection. The city tracks are hit or miss, but they gave Mario Kart a type of setting the series had barely touched before. It also had an absurd amount of content, with tons of characters, cards, costumes, variants, and alternate track layouts, Granted, a lot of that content exists because the game needed endless things to sell you, but it still gives Tour a surprisingly big identity within the series. More importantly, Tour ended up being a major reason Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's Booster Course Pass exists in its current form. A lot of tracks, characters, and assets from Tour either came back directly or clearly influenced what ended up being added to 8 Deluxe. To me, that alone is a good enough reason to rank it above the previous two games. At number 8, I'm placing the Mario Kart Arcade GP series. These are arcade games, so they naturally have a very different feel compared to the usual console Mario Kart. That starts with the fact that they were developed by Namco, which is why they feature crossover characters like Pac-Man and Blinky. Instead of the usual item system, at the start of each race you're given a random set of 3 items that you can roll from item boxes. It feels novel and limiting at the same time. On one hand, it gives the games their own identity. On the other, items don't feel nearly as impactful as they do in the rest of the series. That's especially noticeable because items aren't really given to you based on your position. So when you're in first place, there's a good chance your item won't even be useful, since the vast majority of items in these games are purely offensive. Drifting feels extremely responsive and the driving experience in general is pretty straightforward. But that's also because the tracks, despite looking really good, are actually quite simple. To be fair, this makes sense for an arcade game. These are meant to be immediately understandable, flashy, and easy to jump into for 1 or 2 races. But as a full Mario Kart experience, they end up feeling a lot thinner than the console entries. One of the biggest selling points for the series is how interactive and memorable the tracks feel, but in Arcade GP, a lot of them feel more like simple circuits with pretty set dressing than proper Mario Kart tracks. Also, the commentator in the second game is extremely obnoxious when you're playing through the entire game like I did.
Now on to the final lap. MKWII, is it possible to maintain the lead? MKWII is wiped out by the basin. Wario makes a perfect pass.
At number 7, I'm placing Mario Kart 64. Probably one of the most iconic Mario Kart games. Mario Kart 64 was, and still is, home to one of the most dedicated speedrunning communities in the entire series. This game introduced many elements that would go on to become familiar in later entries, like the golden mushroom and the blue shell. It also revolutionized power sliding and brought it much closer to the system we now know today. Even though the racers and items are still 2D sprites, this is where the tracks became fully 3D, making the racing experience feel much more immersive. And while I don't think the tracks in this game are as well thought out as the ones in later entries, they still exude a lot of love and creativity. Even when the layouts themselves are pretty simple, a lot of these tracks are incredibly memorable, which is probably why so many of them kept coming back in later games. This game also deserves a lot of credit for its multiplayer. Mario Kart was already a multiplayer series from the beginning, but 64 is where it really became one of those classic local multiplayer games everyone remembers playing with friends. This game is also very much on the harder side. I was barely keeping up with the CPUs on 100cc. But unlike Super Mario Kart or Super Circuit, it doesn't feel outright outdated. It feels more like the game has a really high skill floor and an even higher skill ceiling. And because of that, I have the utmost respect for the people who mastered this game and still speedrun it to this day. At number 6, I'm placing Mario Kart World. This game is definitely a weird one, because when it comes to moment-to-moment racing, I think this is by far the best feeling game in the series. From drifting to grinding rails to driving on walls, the game gives you a ton of freedom, but it also doesn't necessarily force the new mechanics on you either. The issue isn't really on the Mario Kart side of things, it's on the world side. I liked the idea of having all the tracks exist inside one connected map, but in practice I think it takes a lot away from the actual racing. When you play a cup, you have to go through each intermission and then you only get to do one lap of each actual track. And the intermissions themselves aren't really anything special. Most of the time, they just boil down to holding the accelerator through what are basically straight lines. It's a shame, because I think the new tracks are really cool, and the same goes for how they readapted the retro ones, but because of the way cups are structured, you barely get to experience them as proper Mario Kart tracks. That's what makes the game so frustrating to me. On paper, this should be one of the most exciting directions Mario Kart has ever taken, but in practice, it often feels like the game is getting in the way of its own best ideas. I will say, the whole connected world concept works a lot better in Knockout Tour. Since that mode is built around one long continuous race, the intermissions actually feel like part of the structure instead of something getting in the way. But in regular Grand Prix, where I just want to race the actual tracks, they end up feeling more like mandatory filler. The jump to 24 players also gives the races a bigger sense of scale, but it can make them feel a lot messier too. Mario Kart has always been chaotic, but with this many racers on the track, there are moments where it feels less like you made a mistake and more like the game just decided it was your turn to get absolutely fried. The open world also felt somewhat empty to me. There are occasional challenges and collectibles here and there, and even though I didn't hate exploring it, I didn't particularly like it either. Ultimately, I just don't think an open world truly fits what makes Mario Kart charming. At number 5, I'm placing Mario Kart Double Dash. When you think of the most experimental Mario Kart title, Double Dash is probably the first one that comes to mind. This is the only game in the series to feature 2 races per kart, with one character driving while the other handles items. And this is such a cool idea, because it adds a whole new layer of strategy to the game. Since each racer can hold one item, you can choose which item to spend and which one to keep at all times. It also helped that the 2-character system wasn't just cosmetic. You could even have 2 players control the same kart, with one person driving and the other handling items. It's definitely a strange idea, but it fits Double Dash perfectly, because the entire game feels built around taking Mario Kart and essentially making it as chaotic as possible. Each character or character pair also has a unique special item, and even though some of them are obviously better than others, they're hilarious to whip out when the opponent least expects it. They also make the characters feel much more distinct than in most other Mario Kart games. The courses in this game are also much more visually impactful compared to the earlier entries, almost resembling themed attractions rather than simple 3D spaces. Driving can take a while to get used to, since this is the only game in the series where you don't hop into a power slide and instead start drifting directly, but once it clicks, it's easily one of the most comfortable driving systems in Mario Kart. And I gotta say, that's probably Double Dash's biggest strength. It has a personality that no other Mario Kart game really replicated. Even if you don't think it's the best one, it's easily one of the most memorable. The real issue with this game is that it's very thin on content compared to most Mario Kart games. It only has 4 cups, since it doesn't bring back retro cups and you also don't have access to battle mode in single player. If it wasn't for that, this game could have comfortably sat somewhere in the top 3. At number 4, I'm placing Mario Kart 7. Probably a hot take, but I really like this game personally. First off, I think this game has the best track selection in the series, if we ignore the one game with 96 tracks. Most of the original tracks are great. I mean, just look at this Rainbow Road. It also brought back a selection of some of the very best tracks from the previous games. Mario Kart 7 introduced gliding, which everyone loves, since it gives the game a new whole dimension. But I think underwater racing is the truly overlooked addition. Yes, the underwater sections in the new tracks aren't anything groundbreaking by themselves, but what this game never gets enough credit for is readapting water elements from older tracks and turning them into actual raceable areas. It also reintroduced coins, which had been missing for a while in the series, and gave you a good reason to collect them beyond just gaining speed. Coins are also how you unlock new kart parts, which you can then customize to your liking. And this is where customization in Mario Kart truly takes off. With different wheels, gliders, and kart bodies, you can create hundreds of different combinations, which gives the game a lot more personality and replay value. The game's roster usually isn't considered particularly good, but honestly I kind of liked having unpopular picks like Honey Queen, Lucky 2, and Wiggler available to play as. Although I do agree that Metal Mario could have just been a color variant or something. When it comes to the driving experience, I think this game is second only to the game I have in first place. There's something about Mario Kart 7 that feels smooth as butter, even if I can't quite put my finger on why. The only thing that sadly hurts this game is the lack of a VS mode, meaning you don't really have a choice but to play Grand Prix when playing single player. At number 3, I'm placing Mario Kart Wii. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you've probably played this one. This is the ultimate Mario Kart party game. It's one of those games that connected generations over time because it was so simple and fun that you could probably ask your parents to play, give them one of these, and even they could enjoy it. Driving with the Wii wheel is probably what makes Mario Kart Wii the most iconic game on this list, but that doesn't mean it's lacking in other departments. It added bikes to the mix, which, aside from being completely overpowered, play very differently from karts. Most of them use inside drift, meaning they cut sharply inward during drift instead of sliding outward like traditional karts. They can also perform wheelies, letting you lift the front wheel for extra speed on straightaways. So in practice, bikes don't just feel like another vehicle type, they let you play with a completely different rhythm. The races also became more chaotic than ever, with the player count increasing from 8 to 12. And that works really well with the game's extremely fun item set. Except for the Thundercloud, I have no idea what went wrong there. This is also the game where tricks were introduced, adding a slight layer of skill expression by rewarding you for timing your input right when jumping off a ledge. I think the best adjective to describe this game is probably flashy. Everything from the introduction of motorbikes and tricks to the track design itself feels clearly designed around spectacle. A good example of this is DK Summit, which is basically a snowboarding style downhill course. The funny thing is, Mario Kart Wii is also not exactly what I'd call balanced. Bikes are clearly better than karts, inside drift is ridiculous, and the Funky Kong Flame Runner meta basically became a meme at this point. But weirdly enough, that imbalance is also part of the game's identity. Mario Kart Wii doesn't feel clean or controlled, it feels explosive, unfair, and completely unhinged, but I guess that's also what makes it special. Most importantly, this is the game that truly cemented itself as the cornerstone of Mario Kart Online. And that longevity isn't just nostalgia either. Between private servers and the massive custom track scene, Mario Kart Wii has basically become its own platform inside the series. Even 18 years after its release, people are still playing it online daily through private servers. At number 2, I'm placing Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. This is basically the ultimate Mario Kart package. It doesn't have the same kind of instantly recognizable identity as something like Double Dash or Wii, but what it does have is almost everything you could possibly want from a Mario Kart game, all polished to an absurd degree. Starting with the obvious, this game has by far the biggest collection of tracks in the entire series, excluding Tour, but that's a mobile game so it doesn't count. With 96 tracks, your favorite track is more likely to be here than not, since the entire series only has 160 unique tracks if you don't count alternate versions or remakes. The roster is also massive, featuring almost every major character you can hope for, plus crossover characters like Link, the Villager, Isabelle, and the Inklings. And while I don't think every character choice is perfect, it's hard to complain too much when the game gives you this many options. Driving obviously feels great, being a modern Mario Kart game and all, but I think the real strength of 8 Deluxe is how refined everything feels. Drifting, tricks, gliding, underwater racing, bikes, kart customization, online, retro tracks, and battle mode all come together into one incredibly polished package. It also helps that Deluxe fixed one of the biggest issues with the original Mario Kart 8 by giving battle mode actual arenas again, instead of making you fight on regular racetracks. That alone makes this version feel way more complete. The game also looks and sounds incredible. The tracks are colorful, detailed, and extremely readable, and the soundtrack might honestly be one of the best in the series. Everything about the presentation makes the game feel premium. As for anti-gravity, I'll be honest, I'm pretty indifferent toward it. I don't think it really changes the gameplay that much, but it also doesn't hurt the experience in any meaningful way. At the very least, it gives the tracks more visual spectacle and lets them twist in ways that wouldn't have been possible before. This game might not be the most personal or experimental game in the series, but it is easily the most complete one. It does pretty much everything well, and even when I don't have much to say about it, that's kinda the point. It's just really, really good. At number 1, I'm placing Mario Kart DS. Yeah, I might be biased because this is the Mario Kart I played the most, but even putting nostalgia aside, this game will always be my favorite. For when it came out, Mario Kart DS was insanely good in pretty much every single aspect. To me, this is still the game that feels the best to drive in. Despite being played on a D-pad, drifting has never felt smoother. In fact, it was probably too smooth, since the optimal way to play is basically drifting all the time, also known as snaking. But even if snaking completely breaks the game at high levels, I also think it's part of what makes Mario Kart DS so satisfying. There's a constant rhythm to the driving that makes every corner feel active, and once the movement clicks, the game just feels incredible. It also has one of the best lineups of original tracks in the series, with so many heavy hitters like Waluigi Pinball, Tick-Tock Clock, Airship Fortress, Delfino Square, Peach Gardens, and Luigi's Mansion. And on top of that, this is where the modern Retro Cup format truly became a series standard, bringing back tracks from older games in a way that would basically define every Mario Kart after it. And most importantly, the sheer volume of single-player content should be the standard for every game in the series. Not only can you play both VS mode and battle mode against the CPU, which are both extremely customizable, but there are even full sets of missions that are always capped off with a boss battle. Like, why has this never properly returned? It was so cool. Mario Kart DS was also the first game in the series to have online multiplayer, and even though it was obviously basic compared to what came later, that alone makes it historically important. This was a handheld Mario Kart with a full set of tracks, retro cups, missions, battle mode, VS mode, online play, unlockables, and even emblem creation. That's what makes this game so special to me. It feels like one of the most complete games in the entire series, and one of the entries that truly helped define what modern Mario Kart would become. Well, that was everything from me. At the end of the day, this is my very personal ranking, and you're totally free to disagree with my opinion. If you do, feel free to leave a comment down to let me know your ranking, and I will see you in the next video.